Chapter 6. The youth awakened slowly. He came gradually. Now, he's not awakening, really. Like, he's awake, right? But it's like battle put him to sleep. It's like the combat dulled his senses, and he's coming out of a deep sleep. That's sort of a metaphor, the way it's being used. He came gradually to a position from which he could regard himself. So like we said last time, he lost his ability for introspection, and now he's able to look at himself and look at his actions, which he wasn't able to do during combat. For moments, he had been examining himself as if he had never before seen himself. And then he picked up his cap from the ground. He moved in his jacket to make it feel more comfortable, and kneeling, tied his shoe. He thoughtfully wiped his face. So it was all over at last. The great test had been passed. The red, frightful difficulties of war had been mastered. He went into a passion of self-satisfaction. He had the most delightful emotions of his life. Standing as if apart from himself, he viewed that last scene. He thought that the man who had fought thus was magnificent. So he's pretty happy with himself. Hey, I didn't run away. I was a great fighter. He felt that he was a fine fellow. He saw himself with those virtues which he had considered as far beyond him. He smiled in deep pride. Upon his companions, he smiled with tenderness and goodwill. "It's hot, isn't it?" he said cheerfully to a man who was wiping his face with his arm. "You're right," said the other, smiling sociably. "I've never seen such foolish hotness." He lay down comfortably on the ground. "Oh, yes, and I hope we don't have any more fight until a week from Monday." There were some handshakings and deep speeches with men whose faces were familiar, but with whom the youth now felt the bonds of tied hearts. He helped a cursing companion to bind a wound of the foot. But suddenly cries of surprise broke out among the men of the new regiment. "Here they come again! Here they come again!" I'm going to pause here for a second and let's do a little bit of analysis of what Crane's trying to do here. Look at these guys. They feel like they've just accomplished something really big. They're shaking hands. They're happy with themselves. The youth especially is sort of caught up in it. But it was one firefight of a battle that obviously is going to have very many more. Here they come again as our next shout. So he feels like he's accomplished some great thing. But what has he really accomplished? Not running away in one firefight? And I think that the way Crane constructs this narrative, I think that's supposed to be underscored here. You suddenly, like you're feeling like he is, like, wow, we really did this great thing. And then all of a sudden, you're like, oh yeah, the enemy's still there. The battle's not over. Here they come again. The man who had lain upon the ground started to get up and said, "Oh." The youth turned quick eyes upon the field. He saw forms begin to come across in masses of a distant forest. He again saw the red flag speeding forward. The bullets, which had ceased to trouble the regiment for a time, came flying again and struck the grass and the branches of the trees. The gunfire looked like strange war flowers bursting into fierce growth. The men murmured. The glow left their eyes. Their dirty faces now expressed a deep sorrow. Think about the change that Crane's showing here. They moved their stiffened bodies slowly and watched in quiet anger the fast approaching of the enemy. They complained to the other, "Oh, this is too much. Why can't somebody send us help? We're never going to live through a second battle. I didn't come here to fight the whole rebel army." Can you feel the change that's happening here? The youth stared. Surely he thought this impossible thing was not about to happen. He waited as if he expected the enemy to suddenly stop, ask his pardon, and leave. It was all a mistake. But the firing began somewhere in the line and ran along in both directions. The sheets of flame developed into great clouds of smoke that rose and dropped in the gentle wind near the ground, and then rolled through the line as through a gate. The clouds were colored an earth-like yellow in the sunlight, and in the shadows were a sorry blue. Those are the two colors of the armies, by the way, the butternut color of the Confederacy and the blue of the Union. And it's interesting how, depending on the shade or the light coming through them, the gun smoke, and it can look either yellow or blue. The flag was sometimes lost in this mass of smoke, but more often it stood out, sun-touched, splendid. In the youth's eyes there came a strange look. His neck was trembling with nervous weakness, and the muscles of his arm felt stiff and bloodless. His hands, too, seemed large and useless. and there was a great uncertainty in his knees. Listen to this description and think about, what Crane might be hinting at here. Weakness, bloodless, useless, uncertainty. All of these words seem to be pointing us in a particular direction. The words that his companions had spoken before the firing began came back to him. Oh, this is too much. What do they think we are? Why don't they send help? I didn't come here to fight the whole rebel army. And that goes back to what his mom said. You don't fight the whole rebel army, Henry. Right? He slowly lifted his rifle and, seeing the field through the smoke, he fired. He stopped and then began to look as best he could through the smoke. He caught changing views of the ground covered with men who were all running like devils and shouting. A man near him, who had been working feverishly at his rifle, suddenly stopped and ran, screaming. A lad whose face had worn an expression of high courage threw down his gun and ran. There was no shame in his face. He ran like a rabbit. There's another animal image. Others began to run away through the smoke. The youth turned his head, shaken by this movement, as if the regiment were leaving him behind. He saw the quickly moving forms. He shouted with a feint and turned around. For a moment, he was like a chicken. Another animal image, a rabbit, a chicken. This, of course, goes back to the proverbial chicken with his head cut off, like he doesn't know what to do. He lost the direction of safety. He was threatened from all points. He began to speed toward the rear in great leaps. Here goes Henry running away. His rifle and cap were gone. He left them behind. His open coat flew in the wind. The canteen was swinging out behind him. On his face was the terror of those things which he imagined. He ran like a blind man. 2 or 3 times he fell down. Once he struck his shoulder so heavily against a tree, he went down head first. Since he had turned his back upon the fight, his fears had been greatly increased. Death about to strike him between the shoulders was much more awful than death about to hit him between the eyes. So it's almost worse to be running than it is to be facing it. When he thought of it later, he got the impression that it was better to view the terror than merely hear it. The noise of the battle were like stones. He believed himself about to be crushed. As he ran on, he mixed with others. He saw men on his right and on his left, and he heard footsteps behind him. He thought that the whole regiment was running away. The sound of these following footsteps gave him his one small relief. He felt that death must first choose the men who were nearest it. They would be the ones who were following him. So he displayed the eagerness of a mad runner in his purpose to keep them in the rear. There was a race. So the fleeing is sort of a race. As long as you stay in front of some other guys, you're not going to be the one who dies. He experienced a shock when he came within view of a group of gunners in action. Now this is the artillery. The artillery's in the rear, right? And he's running from the battle, so now he's covered the entire distance to the artillery. The men there seemed to be completely unaware of the coming danger. They were fighting with a distant enemy and were wrapped in admiration of their own shooting. He saw a brigade going to the relief of tired soldiers. He climbed up a small hill and watched it moving, keeping formation in difficult places. The blue of the line was edged with steel color, and the bright flags shone. Officers were shouting. This sight also filled him with wonder. The brigade was hurrying quickly to be eaten by the mouths of the war god. That's an interesting personification of war, as a god, but also as something with a mouth that just chews up and destroys soldiers. What kind of men were they? Oh, they were some strange and wonderful sort, or else they didn't understand, the fools. And this is, of course, when you look at this image of a brigade marching towards the battle, this was Henry's brigade just a few minutes ago before they engaged. The youth went on, slowing his pace, since he had left the place of noises. Later he came upon a general, seated upon a horse, that lifted his ears in an interested way at the battle. The quiet man looked dull upon such a splendid animal. A moment later the youth saw the general jump excitedly in his saddle. Yes, by heavens they have. The officer leaned forward. His face was aflame with excitement. Yes, by heavens, they've held them. They've held them. He began to roar at the officers near him. We'll beat them now. We'll beat them now. We've got them. The general's face shone upon the earth like a sun. In his eyes was a desire to sing a song. He kept repeating, they've stopped them, by heavens. His excitement made his horse jump forward, and the general merely kicked and cursed at it. He did a little dance of joy on horseback. So you can imagine how Henry's going to feel. He's just run away from a battle because he thought they were going to lose, and they won. So now his regiment's back there, and they held the enemy, and he fled. So what's he going to do in this particular situation? That's the question. And also, I think it's important that we end up with sort of contrast. I mean, we earlier on in maybe chapter 4, Crane narrated Henry's feelings, and he talked about him as trembling and pale and red, and and courageous. Like, it was sort of ambivalent. It didn't know whether he was going to be courageous or afraid. It turns out he's both. In one situation, when the rest of the regiment was staying and fighting, he stayed and fought and felt himself a member of the regiment, a part of something bigger than himself. But when he started seeing his friends run away, he ran away. And so the question is, in this context, is there such a thing as individual courage? Is courage what everybody does? Are you just doing what everybody else does? So I don't know the answer to that question. It's something that we'll have to look at as we continue to read the story, but it's gotten more complicated because now Henry's run away. And this brings up an interesting question. What happens to a soldier who's run away on a battlefield? What's Henry going to do now? He thought he was running for his life, but it turns out that if he had stayed, he would have been victorious. So let's continue on to the next chapter and see what we got.